Good evening. Welcome to the shiur this week of Parshas Bechokosai Chazak. And so we'll go straight into our first question, which I got already at the beginning of the week, where the Parsha Bechokosai is always at about 2 weeks, two Shabbosim before Parshas, before Shavuos. And the reason is that in the Parshas Bechokosai there is the Toichocho, the rebukes, and there's idea that we don't want that to be close to Matan Torah, and therefore the way the schedule has been made of the reading of the Torah, that we have the combined Parshas, etc., to work it out, the Parshas Bechokosai should be one Shabbos plus away from Shavuos. It's interesting this year that at Israel, actually, they have it 2 Shabbos in interval, but fine. Because of the Toichocho being chapter, has a passage full of curses, therefore there is a reluctance to call someone to have that Aliya. People would decline that Aliya. And so there was always, historically, there'd been a lot of difficulties what to do about who's going to have the Aliya of Toichocho. And what became quite popular is that the Baal Korei, who's already there, would just have that Aliya without being called up. What I have heard in some places, they have the minhag that the following Shabbos, the Baal Korei is given a compensation. He's given another Aliya because he took the Toichocho the preceding Shabbos. I don't know how widespread that is. Meanwhile, this is the general practice that the Baal Korei is the one who has the Aliya of Toichocho. The Toichocho is in twice in the Torah. We have once in Parshas Bechokosai and again in Parshas Kisovoi. In Parshas Kisovoi, it is also one Shabbos plus before Rosh Hashanah. So the following Shabbos is Nitzovim. Nitzovim will always be the Parsha before Rosh Hashanah. And the difference is that in Parshas Bechokosai, the Toichocho is in Shlishi. In Parshas Kisovoi, the Toichocho is in Shishi. The dilemma which we have here is if your Baal Korei is a Kohen or Leivi. So normally a Kohen or Leivi would have either the first or the second Aliya respectively. But here it's the third or the sixth Aliya. So how do you deal with that? So actually, the zip code for where this is discussed in Shulchan Aruch is where is the calendar discussed in Shulchan Aruch? So that in the end of Hilchos Rosh Chodesh. So the Tov Chofs, that's the Rosh Chodesh, till Tov Chof Ches. Tov Chof Ches is really the beginning of Hilchos Pesach. So Tov Chof Ches is where there's discussion of the calendar and which parshas go together, etc. So in that place, we've got, this is a quote from a copy from the Mishnah Brura there, where he writes, the Shliach Tzibor stroke, the Baal Korei, he is the one who takes the Aliya be'atzmoi on his own. V'nochen, that's a good idea. Now then he says, Vafilu hu kohen. So what should he do if he's a kohen? So when it comes to Parshas Bechokosai, yochal likros mitchilas Parshas Bechokosai ad acha Toichocho. So he should read from the beginning of the Sedra until the end of Shlishi. That should be given to either to the kohen or in the case of the Leivi. So he will read from Sheni. He'll read Sheni and Shlishi. And then, Uminyan HaKruyim Yashlim Mishom V'Holo. And then you need to have 7 Aliyas. So then one of the Aliyas between Revi and Shvi will be divided into 2. And in that way, you'll be able to make up your quota of 7 Aliyas. That's all very well in Parshas Bechokosai. So the Kohen can read from the beginning, or the Baal Korei can read from Rishon Rosheni all the way till the end of the Toichocho plus. In Parshas Kisovoi, what about in Parshas Kisovoi where it's in Shishi? So that's not possible. It's not possible for him to read from in one Aliya from the beginning all the way till the end of Shishi, because there won't be enough afterwards to divide for the other 6 Aliyahs, other 5 Aliyahs. So then the Mishnah Berurah suggests the other way around. It's Tzamtzem, sheyishtalim min yakrim ad shom, that you should divide 7 Aliyahs and before Shishi, and Shishi will then be what's called Achron. Now, in Chabad this is not done, but in the Welt you are allowed to be Moisif, and so there's an idea of having an 8th Aliyah or plus. But Achron would be an extra Aliyah, so you already got your quota of 7 Aliyahs done, covered, and then the rest of the Sedra is the 8th Aliyah, and for the 8th Aliyah can be a Kohen or a Leivi also. And it refers to the Halocho, etc. Okay, that's all very well according to the minhag of the Mishnah Berurah. And I think most Kehillas do allow the idea of giving Hosofos, and therefore it can have an 8th Aliyah, which can therefore the Baal Korei could have the Toichocho until the end of the Sedra as an Achron. In Chabad we don't do Hosofos. There's a whole tshuva in the Tzemach Tzedek, I think it's similar Lamed Hey, whatever. There's a whole tshuva explaining this whole concept of Bechokosai, and the bottom line is that what you see in the letter of the Rebbe, which is published for Yud Shvat Tafshin Yud Aleph, we don't do Hosofos. Not now. I don't know the whole people why, and as a result, what you're going to do. So then, what I've seen done is that the Baal Korei can't take Shishi, so the Gabe will take Shishi. Also not be called by name, you'll just go over and take it. That's what I've seen being done with Poyol. So we've got here 2 options. In Pashas Bechokosai, it's easier that the Baal Korei reads all the way through till the end of Shlishi, whereas in Pashas Kisove, that will be that solution may not be available. Okay, let's move on to our next question, and that is. So Baruch Hashem, since Yud Aleph Nissen, I was looking for something, a new institution for the COVID Yud Aleph Nissen, and so Rebbe gave me the idea to do a little bit of this shiur in Ivrit, in Hebrew, and so last night I did the first 3 questions of this shiur today. I discussed last night in a Hebrew session. So this morning I already got a question on the question. Okay, so his question was that he is a shliach somewhere in Europe. He is the Baal Korei, but not only that, there's no one even capable of dealing with the Haftorah. Typing error in the on the sheet. Anyway, there's no one else able to read the Haftorah either. Now, he'll have Shlishi and also Maftir. Is that an issue or is it not an issue? So let's read in here. We have the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. So the first quote is from Siman Reish Pei Beis. The second quote is from Siman Reish Pei Dalet. So Reish Pei Beis is the din of Kriyas Torah on Shabbos. If there's no one in the shul who's capable of doing Maftir, only one person, one of the people already had an Aliya. So then he says he still has to have a reading from the Torah before having they're reading the Haftorah. Where is this? The Ima Shvi, what happens if the Shvi doesn't know how to read from the Novi? So then the Shliach Tzibur will say Kaddish, and then the person who knows how to do Maftir will have the Aliya and has to read from it. So let me explain what's going on here. There is certainly in some communities, they will give Maftir to one person, even if that person is not capable of reading the Haftorah, and then the Baal Korei or someone knowledgeable will take over, read the Haftorah, and then the other person will say the brachas. So the Alter Rebbe is not happy with that. See that again. We'll see the second quote. If a cotton was called up for Maftir, and he read from the Torah, but he doesn't know how to do Haftorah, can be with an adult also. So then it talks about someone else filling in. But yesh chilkin al zeh. Lefichoch It's not acceptable lechatchila to call up for Maftir a person who's not capable of reciting the Haftorah. If he was, then someone else will do the Haftorah. So in communities where they do the minhag hagra of reading the Haftorah from a parchment, so most people are not capable of reading without vowels, etc. Haftorah is not such a familiar text. So in those communities, it's quite standard that the Baal Korei also will read the Haftorah. So they won't, it doesn't mean he has the Aliya of Maftir. Someone else has Maftir, but the Baal Korei takes over and reads the Haftorah aloud. The Alter Rebbe is not happy with that. And he says that's a b'diavad, it's not a lechatchila. To explain why. There is a point here that there should not be that reading from Novi is on the same pedestal as reading from the Torah. If it would be conceivable that someone can go up and read from Novi, and he hasn't read from Torah in this setting, so there'll be the perspective that, okay, Reuven had an Aliya in Torah Moshe, in Chumash, and Shimon had an Aliya in Yeshua, or in Yeshaya, whatever it may be. So that's not acceptable. There shouldn't be a person reading from the Novi who hasn't already read from the Torah, and then he also reads from the Novi. So it's an extra. So that's why we have here in this situation to give over that someone else should have Maftir, and the shliach, who's Baal Korei, should read the Haftorah. That's not okay lechatchila, not in Chabad. According to the Alter Rebbe, as I say, in some communities it's done, but it's something which we wouldn't do, and therefore but on the other hand, it's okay for him to have two aliyahs. It's okay for him to have that's what he says in the Reish Pei Beis Sif Yud Ches. He'll have an aliyah earlier on, and if he's the only one who could do Maftir, so he'll go again for Maftir. And where we have it. If the only ones who are able to do Maftir have already had an aliyah, so they'll have a second aliyah. So you'll have one aliyah in our case, our shliach who asked the question, he'll have one aliyah at Shlishi, and he'll have another aliyah at Maftir and Haftorah. But one more point about this, where we have to be careful, is that it's not acceptable for a person to have two aliyahs, one after the other, if it is in two separate Sifrei Torah. So let's say if for some reason Mr. Shvi is the one who's going to do Maftir, and let's say it's on Shabbos Rosh Chodesh or Arba Parshas, where you're taking out a separate Torah, it's not acceptable for one person to stand there by the Torah, and he's read already one from one Sefer Torah, and then switch over to read again from another Sefer Torah. The source for this is the story with the Kohen Gadol, where he would read on Yom Kippur in presence of all the people in the base in the Azara, and he had to read two sections, one from Acharemos and one from Parshas Pinchas, and the second one he said by heart. He didn't read it from another Sefer Torah, and one of the reasons given in the Gemara is Shelo Yoimru, that the people shouldn't get the impression the reason why he's taking out another scroll is because the first one is something faulty. There's something missing there. So I once had this trial, and I've written about it in the Sivim, talking about Simchas Torah. So the Shliach here is actually a Kohen, but in Simchas Torah he would have, he wanted to have Chosen Bereishis. Like, it's okay, a Kohen can have Chosen Bereishis. But then he's the only one in the shul who can do a Maftir. So it's Chosen Bereishis, it's in Bereishis. And then for the Maftir is in Parshas Pinchas. So he can't have one after the other. You can't have one person being quoted by Torah. This is what you have in Shulchan Aruch, the end of Siman Kuf Lamed Hey. Siman Kuf Mem Daled. You shouldn't have one person having two consecutive aliyahs in two separate Sefer Torah. If he had had an earlier Aliya and in between someone else had an Aliya, then that would not be a problem for him to have. So if he was Chosen Torah and then someone else is Chosen Bereshis, then he wants to have to do Maftir in Parshas Pinchas, that would have been okay. Let's move on. So before Pesach, we discussed about the Maaser Sheni coin. If anyone who has a coin, so then there's a time called biur maises of disposal of any maiser which you've hoarded so far, and talk about taking the coin and defacing it and throwing it into the sea, etc. So after Pesach, one of our listeners realized that they've actually got a stash of some maiser coins, which some are from previous years, some are from this year. What are you meant to do now? You didn't dispose of them. By the way, during Chalamoid, I went to Brighton for a few hours and threw my coin as far as I could into the sea. Probably someone else found it later, but fine. I defaced it first. Right. So now, what do they do after Pesach? Now, to remind you, there's the din of biur maestros, of disposal of maestros. So I've got here a quote from a sefer called Chelkas HaSoda by someone called Reb Shneir Zalman Revach, who is a great mumche, expert in halacha of agriculture, etc. And he writes, in reference to your question about someone who did not dispose of his coin, which had designated for the redemption and the exchange for the Maaser Sheni, he did not dispose of it before the last day of Pesach. What does he do now? Now, his question is also, if you remember the discussion then, you could take one coin which has got a value of 20 or 15 prutas. If it's got 15 prutas in a coin, you can use that coin 15 times. So here's it says, you've got this coin. Now, let's say you have a coin you've used 15 times. You've used its full value. Well, on Erev Pesach or Erev Shvisha Pesach, you could take that coin, let's say this euro, you can exchange it for a cent or for a pruta. Then instead of having to throw a euro into the sea, you only have to throw a pruta into the sea. That's legitimate before Zman Habir. But what he's saying here now, but here, since this matbeya has already been kind of seized with Kedushas Maaser Sheni, and it's past Zman Habir, so then you can no longer exchange its Kedusha onto another coin, and you're going to have to dispose of that actual coin itself. So that's the answer to the question, that this euro would have to be thrown into the sea and defaced first. Let's move on. Okay. This next question, well-known minhag of not inviting people to a bris. Question was asked, what about a pidyon haben? Is it the same or is there any difference? So let's trace the background of this inyan. So we have here, this is a Gemara at the bottom of the screen. It's a Gemara Psochim Daf Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Beis, where it says about 7 people are menudin, are how do you translate word menuda? But they are despised, they're disgraced in Lashamayim, and this is a list of things. And this last line on the page is V'yesh oimrim af misha einoi meisav v'chaburo shel mitzvah. One who doesn't join in or in recline in a meeting, in a mitzvah meeting, a mitzvah get together. Toisfus, which actually is on the following page, Kofidal Damad Aleph. So he comments, Toisfus comments, Ve'ein meisav v'sudas mitzvah. If you notice, Toisfus has changed from chaburo shel mitzvah to sudas mitzvah. So he obviously either he had a different gear, so he understood that it means that the chabura refers to a suda. Hainu sudas mila. This refers to a person who declines to participate in a feast of a bris milah, a medrash, the nitzu medina shel. A person who participates in a suda of a bris will be saved from the judgment of Gan. Or nisuin bas talmid chochem, or bas kohen lekohen, or if the marriage, which is a choshev, a marriage, a bas talmid chochem, marrying to a kohen, this is considered also a mitzvah kind of marriage, and so to join in such a suda would be considered a suda's mitzvah. So one who doesn't join in has got this this stigma of being menuda lashamayim. Now let's look at the screen now, top right of the screen. Now we have a piece from the Shulchan Aruch Hilchos Mila, and that is in Siman Reish Samech Hey. And he says that in Shulchan Aruch says the following. The first is that's Noagin Lashus Msuda B'Yom Mila. It's a custom to make a feast on the day of a bris milah, and then the Ramo adds Noagin Noagu Lakachas Minyan Sudas. So he adds that we to try to have a minyan. That's number one. Or Mikri Sudas Mitzvah. Second point is referred to as a Sudas Mitzvah. Third point, V'chal Misha Eino Eichem B'Sudas Mila Havi Kemenudah L'Shamayim. Person who declines to join in the Suda of the feast of the bris is considered banished or disgraced from heaven. Dafke, if the people there are fine people, but if the people there are not fine people, then you don't have to. So that's the Pischei, that is the Shulchan Aruch, the Rama. To this adds we have the Baal Korei. The Baal Korei is a digest of the two main commentaries on the page, Shach and Taz, or whatever it may be. There were several people who made this kind of commentary called Baal Korei, and in the Shulchan Aruch, the main Shulchan Aruch which we use now, it's the second or the third one, and the first one, I think, or the earliest one, was called Rabbi Yeshua Tiktin, for short Maharit. So in this Baal Korei, he says, look at the Baal Korei of my predecessor, the Maharit. So looking back to the middle quote on the right side of the page is from this Baal Korei of Rabbi Yeshua Tiktin. So he writes the following. It says not to get this, Menudel Hashemayim. So then he says, therefore, Yitzava l'shamash. If you don't intend to go to the bris, go over to the shamash, who's going around telling people. It may not be the shamash in the shul. It could even be a servant of, like the caterer, kind of saying you're invited. Go over to the one who's doing the inviting, and tell him not invite me. Don't invite me. So that otherwise, if he invites you, then you're going to be in trouble. And so that's that earlier Baal Korei. Quoted, he says, the second Baal Korei says, look at the Baal Korei. Tell the shamash not to call you. Then he quotes from a sefer Mekoim Shmuel, the name of another sefer. Toiv levatel. It's good to cancel this whole thing that the shamash calls people to the bris milah feast because they may not go. Therefore, they may have good reasons, whatever happening in their life, and because they're invited and they don't go again, so they will be in trouble. So again, I'm not sure whether either of these are referring to a shamash who makes an announcement in shul, or a shamash who would go over to individual people and invite them. But the minhag has developed also that whoever makes the announcements in shul will not announce everyone's invited to the bris. He will announce just that the bris is going to take place. Ploni and Ploni is Media, that there's going to be a bris, and don't do invited for this reason. Fine. Still, the question is, which we haven't answered, what about inviting for a pidyon haben? And so far, I haven't seen any reason to differentiate. If it's a sudas mitzvah, so what's the difference whether it's a pidyon haben or a suda of a bris milah? One more source, which I have here from a sefer Koil Sabris, is one of these specialists for about bris. And he says, Tzorich iyun tuva. I'd like to look into this much more carefully. Perhaps this whole business of declining an invitation is only when the Baal Bris himself, when the actual father, etc., the father or the mother, etc., if they invite you, then I can see more reason for concern. But if someone else, a third party, invites you, then he's not so concerned. Number two, perhaps only if you're invited twice, because there was a certain etiquette of the people of Yerushalayim. They would not go to a meal, to a feast, unless they were invited twice. Then he says a third thing, perhaps it's only when there's no minyan without you. As there is a slight indication from the Shulchan Aruch He's looking at the Shulchan Aruch. It says it's customary to have a minyan. And then he says one who doesn't join in. So you get a slight impression that it's dafka, if his absence prevents the happening of a minyan. So coming back to the question of Pidyon Haben, does it also apply to Pidyon Haben? Don't see a strong reason not to. However, if the people who are inviting are the Baalei Simcha themselves, then I see that there is a certain similarity. The point I must say, though, that the minhag is to be makbid only by a bris, and I don't really have a very clear reason. We do have also this, that if there's a minyan without them, then they're not included in this Menuda Lashamayim, etc. Again, I don't see a strong reason to differentiate between Pidyon Haben and Bris Milah, and that which it says in Tzal Midosh Shagenim. All right, there may be other wonderful things about going to Pidyon Haben of equal or greater. I don't know. Okay, let's move on. So here, the question here is: someone asked me this morning, or was it yesterday morning? Goes to his local shul, davens Ma'ariv early on Friday night, and so the question is: you get home after an early Ma'ariv, can you start the meal when it's close to the time of Sfiras Omer? So here's an interesting halacha in Shulchan Aruch. He talks about eating before Sfiras Omer, and he says, "Lo yaschil lechol afilu suda ketano." It's not necessarily Friday night, the weekday also. You shouldn't have a meal, even a small meal, chatzi shor kodim zman sfira, a half an hour before the time of sfira. Now that's okay. And the Alter Rebbe adds another interesting thing: dahainu chatzi shor kodim bein hashmoshes, half an hour before bein hashmoshes. And this is very interesting because we generally wait for Tzesek Chovim for a complete nightfall. So we wouldn't count. So really, it looks like it could be even an hour between the time where you can't start a meal until you're actually going to count Sfira. Now, earlier on in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, he had said that the prevalent minig was that the people would count Sfiras Omer during Bein Hashmoshes. Because Sfiras Omer is seen as a mitzvah drabonon, therefore they would take the view of Sofik drabonon lekula, and therefore they permitted themselves to count Sfira during Bein Hashmoshes. That explains very well why the Alter Rebbe says that you wouldn't be able to start a meal within a half an hour before sunset. Whereas according to the minhag which we follow of waiting till full nightfall to do Sfiras Omer, then it would have been more logical that the half hour would be a half hour before nightfall. But this is what the Alter Rebbe says. So that seems to remain the halacha that if you daven Ma'ariv early and you come home, you should be making. The main thing is actually making hamotzi more than just over half an hour before Bein Hashmoshes. That's before Shkia. I would add though that there's a Shkia Hamitis, a Shkia Niris. Even if it's less than half an hour before the Shkia on the calendar, you still have a leeway of several extra minutes, so you could still make Kiddush and make Hamotzi. But if it's like 20 minutes before Shkia, in other words, pretty much the time of Lichtzenden, that would be a little bit late to start making Kiddush if you haven't counted Sfira. Let's move on. So, this is a continuation of last week's discussion about how do you refer about a name for a parent, whether using the parent's name when you have your father's called Moshe and you have a young kid running around called Moshe, you have to call him in his presence. I read from Yigos Moshe, etc. So in the conversation last week, someone asked, what do I do if I'm called up to the Torah and the Gabba asks me, what's your father's name? Am I allowed to say my father's name? So I didn't have the answer at my fingertips. And here we have, this is from the Piskei Tshuva on the, in Hilchos Kibbutz Avayim in Siman Resh Mem. He writes the following. Although it says in the Shulchan Aruch that you should not call your father by name, but if others ask you, whose son are you? You're allowed to say, I am the son of Reb so-and-so. He brings an interesting proof. In the Yam Shel Shlomo, Reb Shlomo Luria writes that the Rosh, Rabbeinu Osher, he would refer to his father, to his Rebbe, Maram, or Meir of Rothenburg. He would say, my Rebbe, Reb Meir. He didn't just say my Rebbe, he said my Rebbe, Reb Meir. The reason is because, as the Rosh, he says, the Mashal, he says, because the Rosh had several Rebbes, and therefore, if he said my Rebbe, it wasn't clear which Rebbe he meant. But if it's your father, says the Marshal, he says, you're not allowed to say my father so-and-so by his name, because you only have one father. The Tur, Rabbi Yaakov, often says, Vadoni Ovi Horosh Zal, it's probably 1,000 times written in the Tur. So he says, my father, the Rosh. When he uses the abbreviation, so he's saying he's a Rosh L'Chol Yisrael, a leader of Kol Yisrael. But otherwise, a son shouldn't refer to his father by name, because there's a lack of clarity. So on this, the Piskei Tshuva concludes, but where there is a need to mention your father's name because the other party doesn't know and needs to know your father's name, then that would be okay. Now, the impression you get here is, he says it clearly, you should refer to your father. Someone asks you, what's your father's name? So you'd say, my Reb so-and-so. In the Sefer Oitzer Kibbutz Avayim, there's a lot of discussion about this. I question, what would that be if someone asks you, what's your mother's name? What title are you going to say then? We don't use a Reb for a lady. What are you going to use? My mother's name is, say your mother's name. So I don't know how you're going to get around that. Okay. Someone is pointing out that the business about not skipping on a bris, on the feast of a bris, has got to do with Eliyahu Hanovi being at the bris, and therefore it would not apply to a pidyon haben, which we don't have. That may be, if we find that documented, that would be explain the difference. Meanwhile, you saw in all the sources, the Tosfos, etc., we didn't see anything that it's got to do with Eliyahu Hanovi. And Eliyahu Hanovi, by the way, is he at the Suda or is he at the actual bris? Because the bris is, that's where you have the Kisei Shel Eliyahu. We don't have a Kisei Shel Eliyahu at the Suda. And what we're seeing from the Tosfos is they say the Lashon Sudas HaBris, the emphasis on the Suda rather than the actual bris, which is done earlier. Okay, well, if we find that that would be helpful. Right, let's move on. So last week we had the discussion about came up about muksa and why what's more of a door being I raised the question, perhaps the fact that the door doesn't move from A to B, is that a reason why it should not be a problem of muksa? Because the Alter Rebbe has this loshon that because the door is mechuberes ve'ein kan tiltul klal, and because it's attached, therefore it's not a problem of muksa. So I raised the question: what about, let's say, moving a switch or something, moving for something which is connected to a hinge? Is that considered muksa because it's not going anywhere? So I did a bit more research during the week, and I realized that I was wrong in that assumption. And one of the simple proofs is, it says very clearly in the Gemara, it talks about a person who passed away, and you're not allowed to move you're not allowed to move any of the organs. Now, those organs, like a finger, nothing, you mustn't move anything of the that's not going anywhere. It's still attached to the rest of the body. It's movements on the spot rather than moving from A to B. And so and it's still definitely muksa. So there's to move the switch, assuming that the switch is muksa. So the fact that it's on a swivel doesn't take away. In fact, you're not moving it from A to B. But so then, what does the Alter Rebbe mean here when he says that the door is mechuberes ve'en kan tiltul klal? So where did I find this? In the Encyclopedia Talmudis? There's a whole sort of very long entry on muksa. So one of the newer volumes, and so I saw he brings the Alter Rebbe, and basically is the following. He brings up a following idea. The reason for muksa, there's the three main reasons given for the Issur muksa. And one of them is as a deterrent to carrying. If you're not going to be able to handle it, so then you're not going to carry it out into the street. So muksa is coming kind of as a protection to the issue of Hatorah of carrying into the street. It therefore follows that muksa should not apply to something which is not portable. Something which is grounded, which is not going anywhere. So then there's no question of Hatorah. Therefore, there shouldn't be a problem of muksa. So that's what they say. What that could be the pshat also in the Alter Rebbe's lashon here, quoting the Torah, that something which is mechuber, not because it's swiveling and not going anywhere, but because it can't go anywhere because it's attached to the ground, attached to the building. That there, and back to the question of a switch. So if you ask me, is a switch a muksa? Well, according to this svara, that something which is attached to the ground is not muksa, and therefore you would also be able to argue the same thing with a switch. But as mentioned last week, the Alter Rebbe doesn't paskin this way, and paskins that it would become something. The fact it's attached to the ground is not in itself a reason that it shouldn't be able to be stigmatized as muksa. Someone's asking here, is it a problem to attend a bris and leave before the Suda? So long as you weren't invited, I don't think that's a problem. And and you see very often the minig Yisrael you have by a bris, there can be 50 people, 60 people, and comes to the Suda is kam minyan. So if they weren't invited, and also no one, it's not normal to prepare a Suda for all the people who will actually attend the bris. And that's the normal thing. There's another side, another way of looking at it, saying possibly the fact that you were at the bris and there was a bit of mazonos and you had a bit of mazonos, so you also participated in the Suda by having that bit of mazonos. So you've already done your participation. That's another way of looking at it. Okay, let's move on. So I had a wonderful guest last Shabbos, and he tells us that he's actually was Megaya recently. Very wonderful person. But past Sukkot, he says, it was Shabbos during Sukkot, and there was someone had left a lulav on the bimah. And so he was asked if he could pick up the lulav and put it somewhere in a side place. So we were discussing at the table, why is a lulav more muktzah than a bunch of flowers? Bunch of flowers is you are allowed to move from one place to the other. So why should the lulav on Sukkot, on Shabbos of Sukkot, obviously in Yom Tov you use the lulav, but on Shabbos, why is the lulav more muktzah than a bouquet of flowers? And the answer is that there's something called huksel mitzvasa. It's consecrated for its mitzvah, and you're not allowed to use it for anything else. So at kedei kach that you're not allowed to on Sukkos, you wouldn't be allowed to smell the hadassim consciously, because they are consecrated for the mitzvah of arba minim, huksel mitzvasa. You wouldn't be allowed to indulge in enjoying the fragrance of the hadassim. So, whereas a bouquet of flowers you can enjoy in whichever way you want, but a lulav on Shabbos, not on Shabbos, any other Shabbos it could be like a bouquet of flowers. On Shabbos during Sukkot, because it's designated for the mitzvah of Sukkah, and you cannot use it for anything else, That makes it so much more chomer, and that's what we're reading over here. This is from Tov Resh Nun Ches. Unfortunately, it's not. We don't have it in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, where it says here on Shabbos you're not allowed to move the lulav if it's on the even if it's the first day is Shabbos, and you're not allowed to move it. It's the Havik Even, because the lulav kind of has a status of muksa similar to a rock. The estrog you are allowed to. The reason is because you're allowed to enjoy the fragrance of the estrog. What's the difference? Why can you not smell the hadassim on Sukkot, and you are allowed to smell the estrog? Because the hadassim, its primary hanoah, its primary benefit is the fragrance. Has become huksal mitzvah. Estrog, by contrast, is a food. So its primary hanoah is food. You're not allowed to eat estrog during Sukkot, but the hanoah of the smell is a secondary hanoah, and therefore you are allowed to smell it. And because of this, he says the estrog is not muksa. And he says don't put it on some fabric, because then it's going to give the fabric a fragrance, which may be mild. Okay, let's move on. So someone asked me about the project of writing a Sefer Torah, and they wanted to, it's a new Sefer Torah, and they wanted to take the Sefer Torah unfinished to one location, another location, and then the Sefer Torah will have been completed in 3 locations, significant locations. What's the story? Is there any problem with that? And the Shailas Chochem Chassid Shuva, the person sent me 3 answers of the Rebbe about and related to this, to help me formulate the answer. But meanwhile, Bichlal, about moving a Sefer Torah, and this is, I think, very timely. A lot of people are asking about taking a Sefer Torah to a park, to do Sarasa Dibris, and I've been very discouraging. I don't like the idea of taking out a Sefer Torah to a park. A Sefer Torah is a sacred thing, and the Rebbe never said make Kriyas Torah in parks. He said bring children to shul. If the shul is not big enough, so they do it in the front yard of the shul or something like that. But to take it out into a public place is not so posh at all. So two sources which I have. One is here. This is the end of Siman Kuf Lamed Hey in Nair Chaib, where he talks about taking a Sefer Torah to people who are in prison. So you wouldn't be allowed to bring them a Sefer Torah, even a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And then he says there is a way, if you prepare a special cupboard for it or something, and you bring it a couple of days before, there's a way around it. But there is something about not schlepping a Sefer Torah. That's to talk about kosher Sefer, complete Sefer Torah. The other part, which is this is in the Zohar, I think Pashas Achrei, Daf Ayin Aleph, Chelek Gimel Daf Ayin Aleph. It says there's a whole thing there about Sefer Torah and whether the Mesim are aware what's going on. And it has the following. This piece of Zohar, if you ever go through the whole Minor Lashon, this is in that piece at the end of the Minor Lashon. There's several pages of Zohar. Tona Abra Behuda, Yom Echad Havaka Ozla. One day, Cheskia and Rabbi Yesa were on Beurcha. They were on a journey. Aro Begush Chalav. They came to a place called Gush Chalav. Probably it's know where it is, but I don't know where it is. Bahava Choriv. It was a place in ruins. Yosvu Somuch Lebe Kivri, and the 2 of them sat down near the cemetery. Vereb Yese have beyode chad chutra or kitra, the Sefer Torah the iskara, and Rabbi Yese had with him, he had a stick of the Sefer Torah or a column of the Sefer Torah which had been torn. And then he said, Adi Yasvu Isragish chad kivra kamayu, and then there's a whole dramatic story how one of the graves started speaking and saying there must be a terrible misfortune happening in the world. That's why they've come out with the Sefer Torah. And this is one of the strong sources about not schlepping a Sefer Torah. Now, here wasn't a kosher Sefer Torah. It was just a piece of a Sefer Torah. And still, you got this whole story about not schlepping it around. Of course, you can distinguish between a completed Sefer Torah, which was then fell into disrepair, or an unfinished Sefer Torah, but that's a possibility. On the other hand, could be the other way around. Now, here we've got three answers of the Rebbe. One is to my late uncle, Reb Dayan Raskin, who I actually took the trouble to call up his son, my cousin, and asked him a bit more about the story. This is around Tov Shin Nun, and they had written a Sefer Torah, and it was going to be brought to Morocco. And the Sefer Torah was finished in 770, and then it was to be brought to Casablanca. He wrote into the Rebbe about this. You can see about bringing the Sefer to the new Sefer Torah to Morocco. Yevarer etzel Rav Mumche oifen tiltal Sefer Torah. You should ask a Rav. No, he said the Rebbe underlines Mumchens, who knows what he's talking about, who's got experience about carrying the Sefer Torah. So there it was a completed Sefer Torah, and Air Maroc kindly provided a separate seat on the airplane, and so the Sefer Torah was wrapped in with a seat belt, and it was on a separate seat throughout the journey. So that story, which doesn't really help so much with our case. The one beneath this is an answer to one of Anash, who had written a Sefer Torah in order to merit the redemption of the library of the Rebbe Rashab, the Schneerson collection from the Lenin Library in Moscow. And he asked the Rebbe, should they delay with the completion of the Sefer Torah until the library is liberated? Which the Rebbe answers. You can see the Rebbe's writing. It's why should you delay the completion and the hachnosa and the reading of the Sefer Torah? Why should you do such a thing? And obviously, this completing of the Sefer Torah should be done without schlepping it from one city to another as much as possible. So I don't know the circumstances behind this project or this Sefer Torah for redeeming the Sforim, but you can see the Rebbe's point of not schlepping it from town to town as much as possible. Again, I don't know clearly whether it was a finished one or not. I don't know. The third one is very interesting. This is dated Tov Shin Mem, and it's written addressing the Rebbe, and it's from the Bukhara community in Queens, in Forest Hills, and they're making a new Sefer Torah for the Bukhara community, and they want to invite the Rebbe to join in to the participation. The Rebbe should write the last letters of the Sefer Torah. They then add, if the Rebbe can't come to their shul for this thing, we are ready to bring the Sefer Torah to the Rebbe to write those letters. To which the Rebbe, on the first thing the Rebbe says, he doesn't even in 770, he doesn't join in the dedications of new Sefer Torah, and therefore he declines that invitation. But then he says, Chas v'sholem l'taltel ha-Sefer Torah cholo. Now here is very clear that we're talking about an unfinished Sefer Torah, and they were ready to bring it to 770 to be finished, and then I guess to take it back to Queens. And as here he uses a Halocho Chas v'sholem. So what I'm seeing from this is a very strong reluctance of schlepping even an unfinished Sefer Torah from place to place. And so I guess this is also without a tilt to me earlier. So this idea of having a project of an international Sefer Torah and being a bit here and a bit there and somewhere anywhere else does not seem to be something which we should be advising. The Torah has an influence of the whole world, but not we should be schlepping the Sefer Torah everywhere else. We should be schlepping towards the Sefer Torah. That was actually the background to this halacha, that you don't schlepp the Sefer Torah to Adam Choshuv, you schlepp the person to the Sefer Torah. Okay, we have now a couple of minutes left, and someone pointed out to me something which I wasn't aware of in the tefillah of Honor B'choyach. So Honor B'choyach is significant, especially during Sfiras Ha'omer. How it's got to do with elevation, and that's because it's got 42 words corresponding, and you've got in this other Sedurim Al Siddur, it's got the abbreviation Shemab, so it's said at the end of Karbonis, elevating the Karbonis. It's said by Krishma Shalamita when the Neshama is going to be Oile. It's said on Friday before the Chodoidi when you got the Aliya of the Shesha Shemei Hamaise. By Sivir Hashoime doesn't this Hezbollah doesn't work because you need 49, not 42, and so there's a different cheshbon. Okay, which I think we discussed this last year or 2 years ago. But meanwhile, we have here these 7 lines, each made of 6 words. Now here on the first one, second one, third one, 4 on the 4th line, Borchem Taharem, bless them, purify them. Rachameit Tzidkoscha, the mercy of your kindness, Tomed Gomlem, you should always bestow upon them. What you have over here is from the Siddur Shalom, which was published, if I'm not mistaken, in Tov Kuf Beis, before the Alter Rebbe was born. The Siddur Shalom was written in Nusach Ashkenaz. It's got a lot of Kabbalah in it. Okay, so that's the Siddur Shalom. The second quote you have here, this is from the Siddur of Yaakov Emden, published approximately the same time. And again, it has Borchem Taharem Rachamei Tzidkoscha. Then you have here, the third copy is from what's called Siddur Avodas Yisrael, otherwise perhaps known as the Bear Siddur, published in Germany, in Berlin, Tov Reish Chof, somewhere about there. I'm not good with the English dates, I'm not going to try. But meanwhile, there's been a change here. From Rachamei Tzidkoscha, Borchem Taharem Rachamim. Bless them, purify them, have mercy on them. Tzidkoscha Tomed Gomlin. So here you have a change. I'm emphasizing this because it's not as if there's a difference between Ashkenaz and Sfarad, because Rabbi Yaakov Emden also is Ashkenaz and the Siddur Shalom is also Ashkenaz. And here we've got an innovation that around Tov Reish Chof, it's changed from Rachamei to Rachamim. So who's responsible for that change? So this is the last quote you have on the page is from a sefer called Vayeta Yitzchok, from someone called Yitzchok of Satanov, and he did a lot of changes to the Siddur. His reputation is that he was affiliated to the Maskilim, and somehow a lot of his changes were accepted in the Bear Siddur, etc. And so, but you can see he makes this point in this. This is from the Sefer Vayeta Yitzchok. That's his Sefer. He says, "Rachameim kein tzorch loima bilti smichus lezug hamilos." It should not be Rachamei Tzidkoscha. Now, I want to explain something. In Mishnah's Chasidim, etc., there is something about the words of Ogona B'choyach Dafka being in pairs. And you can see here in the Shalosh Siddur, there's a dot separating every 2 words. Now that doesn't fit with Pshat. Some of the sentences don't make sense that way. But like on the B'choyach Gedulas has to go together. Yet there's Al Pi Kabbalah, there's a pause between every 2 words. Fine. According to the Kabbalah way of having a pause between every 2 words, so then Rachamei Tzidkoscha go together. The way we have it in our Siddur is we have the Aleph Beis Gimel, and then Yud Tov Tzadik. So we've divided each of these lines into pairs of 3 words. And therefore, Beis Tesh Reish go together, Tzadik Tov Gimel go together. So perhaps that's what gave this Yitzchok of Satanov this idea to change it. But there's no earlier source, as far as I can see, for this change, and so it's innovated by this Yitzchok of Satanov, who's also, by the way, the one responsible for the change to Mashav Haruach Hamered Hagoshem instead of Hageshem, and somehow it crept in, but it's not original Nusach Ashkenaz. It's crept into the Ashkenaz of late, in other words, of the last whatever, not 150 years, 180 years, but it's not from the original Ashkenaz. The Eibishter should show us mercy and bestow upon us tzedek and chesed, and we should be yazecha to the Gola Shlema of Shiach Tzidkein of Meheru Yameinu Mamash. Shabbos.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good.
I did miss out Hagoimel because I had already my minion without it, so and I didn't have much to add to it. So yeah, Carlton.